Good evening, everybody. It is Friday, May 30th, and I am doing this video as a thank you and a response to the man whose YouTube channel I've only recently started following, the functional Melancholic. I find his content interesting and eloquent and worth emulating in terms of lifestyle choices. I very much relate. I've been a quote unquote starving artist all my life. I was a journalist. Now I'm going to attempt to live on a sailboat um, with my fiance, husband, eventually. And I also have a huge Cassandra complex because I never envisioned myself writing nonfiction, but after having been a crime reporter, I interrupted my fiction writing to write this book. It is a book about mass shooters. It's called Strange Fire in a Vacuum, Understanding the Social Epidemic of Mass Shootings in America. And in this book, I basically let fly with my armchair forensic psychologist bit and analyze. It's like a snapshot of what I see going wrong in American culture. And I actually published it. I wrote it and then I tried to get some feedback from people, and the feedback wasn't great. So I sat on it, and then I saw more. Part of my thesis was that mass shootings were a prelude to more organized political violence. And so at a certain point, I think it was in the summer of 2020, I saw more and more violence connected to Black Lives Matter. I predicted a January 6th type reaction to the election. And specifically, I'm reacting to the functional melancholics romanticizing the apocalypse, why we secretly hope the world ends. Because this was another thing that I wrote about, was the propensity for people who create movies and TV shows to popularize post-apocalyptic scenarios, and how that sort of reflects for me a certain angst that is operating in millennials and Gen Zers. So in his video, he's talking about burnout and exhaustion that we are all facing, and how we secretly yearn for an apocalypse because it will short circuit the pressures that we feel in our daily lives. I have felt that. Another thing that I did in this book was I tried to offer a bit of a cross-cultural perspective, because I was an ESL teacher and taught English to Japanese and Chinese students and learned a lot about Asian culture in the process. So I've now started more and more on social media to talk about clinical burnout, exhaustion. It's very interesting how the lexicon of mental illness goes in circles, right? So in the 18th century, 19th century, the forerunners of modern psychotherapists, people back in Freud and Jung's day, doctors used to, it following the Industrial Revolution, they would have diagnoses called neurasthenia and nervous exhaustion. And those are specifically post-industrial reactions to the impositions of factory and urban settings. on people. It's very interesting history. That history is not discussed so much in this book, but in this book, I do talk about the term that the Japanese have for young people who are basically incels. That's what we call them: burnt out, depressed, isolated little incels. Failure to thrive, refuse to go to school, make anything of themselves, get a job because they feel they can't compete. Well, in Japan, this burnout and this isolation is very extreme. The behaviors are very extreme, and it affects young people and it affects old people. It specifically affects people who feel that they are ill equipped to compete in this hyperdrive of the industrialized, advanced economy that they are in. Okay. And the term for it is hikikomori. And I recognize a little bit, um, I recognize of this, I've been through this before. Okay. Okay. So let me start. Okay. Okay. I'm starting here on page 119 if you get my book and you want to read along. In Japan, people are just now figuring out how to deal with the hikikomori. That is their term for the depression and paralysis that we identify as millennial burnout, or more accurately, failure to launch. In Christian spiritual terms, it is called acedia. In Japan, it takes the form of severe agoraphobia, with young adults becoming overwhelmingly reclusive, sleeping excessive amounts, and relying solely on TV and video games for the stimulation of their waking hours. Many refuse to leave their homes and develop an inability to communicate with others. It is a peculiar housebound extreme variant of clinical depression. This development in Japanese culture, where mass shootings are incredibly rare, suggests to me a propensity for Japanese people to internalize economic stagnation as personal failure. Their youth are more likely to withdraw from public view as a means of avoiding the ruthless and rampant destruction of the individual's health and sanity at the altar of economic progress. They do not rebel, they go limp and shut down. This is a much more passive and feminized expression of suicidality, as failing to thrive is a form of enacting death in slow motion. Hikikomori is also present in elderly and isolated individuals, people whose family structures have disintegrated under the disruptive, oppressive norms imposed by Japanese work culture in the wake of 50 years of rapid economic development. Hikikomori affects mostly those who are responding to societal messages that they are either worthless or obsolete, people for whom the economy does not provide a secure identity. The two faces of hikikomori are young people blocked from full entry into Japan's highly competitive, overbearing workforce. Oh, if you want to learn more about that in China, look up 996 culture. Okay. And old people who have exhausted their capacity as full-time productive workers. It is incredibly hard to obtain a firearm in Japan. The Japanese have some of the strictest application and screening processes of any developed nation. This alone does not account for the lack of violence, though. I contend that there are culturally encoded forms of expressing frustration, despair, and anger that lead Japanese people to resort to extreme agoraphobia rather than external violence. I was hikikomori at times when I was married to my right-wing psychopath ex-husband, whom I married when I was only 19. He told me that he was the best thing that could ever happen to me and that I was worthless as anything but an extension of himself. He had a distinctly religious rationale for telling me that he would kill me if I ever left him. Because I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, he used my diagnosis as a justification to control every aspect of my life. For 7 years, I was not allowed to have my name on our bank account, have any say in where we would live, and could not even drive our car. I used to suffer depression so severe that I would be too tired to get out of bed for about 18 hours of the day. It was also meds. The meds were doing that as well. I used to strand myself in the bathtub. Literally, I would drain the tub and find that I just didn't have the energy to really get out properly. So I'd just lay there, naked on the cooling ceramic until I got a second wind. Then I'd use that second wind to go back to bed. Therapists inform me that depression, especially depression in women, was often anger turned inward. The millennials in the United States are dealing with a lack of economic recovery, prolonged stagnation, and even more lies and deceptions from the state than I was when I graduated from college in 2005. 40 to 60% of college students are reporting an anxiety or depression disorder. The mass shootings, economic stagnation, political violence, and polarization in rhetorical discourse have made them paranoid, hypersensitive, and unfocused. Agoraphobia and avoidance behavior accompany these high rates of conventional, diagnosable mental disorders. As a generation, American millennials all have a form of adjustment disorder. Economic adjustment disorder. It comes from being left behind and stuck at home until the age of 26, as entry into the workforce no longer carries with it the ability to provide for oneself as an adult. Built by their parents for rent and constantly told how immature they are by the media, younger millennials, and now I would add Gen Z, is going through this same shit. Younger millennials defer many of the major milestones of life, including owning a car, graduating from college, getting married, and having children. A friend of a friend used to be an organizer for the SEIU, and the union exploited her in ways that mirrored my experience as a journalist. Low pay, chronic insecurity, inflated unrealistic expectations, a hypocritical and coercive use of extreme unpaid overtime. The last newspaper I worked for violated the Fair Labor Standards Act, made its reporters sign arbitration agreements at hire, and coerced us into working 20 to 30 hours of unpaid overtime weekly. Our editors also coerced us into falsifying timesheets. This former labor organizer was similarly overworked by the SEIU and later became a marijuana edibles distributor. She shredded her undergraduate student loan paperwork and made stationery out of it. Then she got a master's in geographical studies, and now she is doing Muay Thai and mixed martial arts competitively because she makes bank, not from geographical studies, but from the edibles business. This is both sad and triumphal to me. Sometimes it seems that there is nothing to do in this country but address the pain of people younger than us or older than us. Meanwhile, the nation stifles analytical talent that does not directly feed corporate interests, leaving a huge segment of people overeducated and underskilled, while the problems of inequality and systemic corruption reach septic proportions. Right now, in America, as in China, it isn't no rest for the wicked. It's no rest for the weary, and the wicked are taking advantage of that. The trade war with China is just the mask that the underlying lack of economic recovery here and underlying economic stagnation there wears. And that mask is being manipulated and molded at the highest levels to suit the corruption of Russian oligarchs, American corporate vultures, and charismatic communist patriarchs alike. These times are fertile ground for toxic masculinity and identity crises. I'm pretty sure that mass shootings are not a direct result of political corruption, but merely a corollary to it. I'm fairly confident that in societies with a healthy, normal index of overall trust in government among citizens, these kinds of violent killing sprees are kept to a minimum, even when gun ownership is similarly common. Although no developed country really comes close to rivaling the rate of gun ownership in the United States, there are some with similarly easy access to firearms and where household ownership is considered normal. Although it spawned Breivik, Anders Breivik, Norway is one such country. Norwegians inhabit a much more cohesive society class-wise, and Norway's, I don't know if this is pronounced Gini or Gini coefficient, GINI, the statistical measure representing inequality, is much lower than the United States coefficient. Norwegians report much lower levels of stress and loneliness and much higher levels of happiness and overall life satisfaction in surveys compared to Americans. Mass shootings are extremely rare in Norway, as well as in Switzerland, New Zealand, and many countries in Africa or Asia. In some of these countries, cultural identity is much more cohesive, and in others, communitarian values prevail over an atomized, individualistic, suburban lifestyle. And then I go on and on about some of my critique of the baby boomer generation, but I'm going to skip ahead because this is in response to Functional Melancholics Glyphs video. So in a later chapter, so what was that chapter I was just reading from? Chapter 8, Polarization of the Political Spectrum, why mass shooters may or may not be classified as terrorists, and why it ultimately doesn't matter if they are. So the next section I'm going to read to you is from the chapter on media illiteracy, because I think there's a tie-in between conspiracy theories and apocalypse, what do you call it? Fetishization of the thirst for apocalypse in our pop culture and conspiracy theories among an increasingly media illiterate population. Okay. So here I'm talking about younger millennials, but this applies to Gen Z more and more and more. Gen Z wasn't really like a term. We weren't really talking about it as much when I was doing the research for this book, okay? This is a generation that largely came of age after 9/11 and was raised on the literature and movies of apocalyptic threat. From Independence Day to The Thinning to The Hunger Games, even the more laughable New Age conspiracy theories such as Y2K and the 2012 Mayan calendar prophecy of the end of the world created a residual stain. The Mayans died out, so dead people don't make calendars. Mystery solved, I used to say. But whenever one conspiracy theory fades into the background, another crops up and takes its place. I was born in 1981, so 9/11 happened in my sophomore year of college. This means that 9/11 and the lack of transparency in our government's response to it took place after I had had a formative intellectual period. 9/11 and the rush to war in two countries, the failure of honesty represented by the weapons of mass destruction bullshit rationale for the war in Iraq, the erosion of integrity and validity in our foreign policy footprint, and the distortion of values inherent in the Bush Doctrine represented a distinct rupture in my concept of the American state as such. An intellectual threshold had been crossed, a violation of normative standards of justice, response, and of responsiveness to and respect for the American people as a legitimating source of state power. But for Americans 10 to 20 years my junior, there was no such intellectual formative period. no pre 9/11 era of ostensibly reasonable governance. Thus, alienation and mistrust of government in these younger Americans is not a departure from pre existing norms, but a standard of intellectual life unto itself. This does not make them sharper observers of state power, but rather duller, more gullible, and more prone to uninformed skepticism of just about any institution. They grew up in an ironic fog of unquestioning questioning, wherein it was taken for granted that it is beyond the power of the individual to demand truth from the powers that be, and that therefore truth is inaccessible and unworthy of one's time. Speculation, on the other hand, about false flag events and secret societies such as the Illuminati as an activity distinct from demanding governmental accountability and meaningful reform is almost a form of entertainment among these millennials, as it gives rise to expressions of alienation and mistrust without attaching a burden of civic responsibility to it. Older Americans are just as susceptible to conspiracy theories, but they tend to fall prey to old saws that fit their religious prejudices. A religious right couple I know in their 50s are still hung up on prophecies of a new world order. Ever heard of the Bretton Woods Conference, the IMF, the WTO, GATT, General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs? Any of this ring a bell with you? This new world order that you are afraid of happened before you were born, and you are its primary beneficiaries. I can scream at them until I'm blue in the face, but nothing can unseat the rock solid foundation of their Christian persecution complex because it is built on impenetrable, willful ignorance. That's enough for today. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much for your work on your channel, Functional Melancholic. I will be in touch.